Hey everyone, thanks for making it to the webinar today. We came up with a few new enhancements to the Sandbox feature in Zoho CRM this month and wanted to let you know about how to access it and implement it before we wrapped up the year. I'm Sushmita from the Zoho community team. My colleague Roshni, the product manager for Sandbox, is also presiding this session. And we are also joined by Hari and Selva, who have been working on developing Sandbox, who are available today throughout the session. So you will be able to ask any questions related to Sandbox. Let's quickly run through these housekeeping points before we get into the webinar. Audio is available through your computer. Attendees are muted. Ask any questions using the questions interface. Additionally, post the webinar during the Q&A session. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask any questions, use the raise hand option to do so. Right. So now let's start with Sandbox. Let's take a look at an overview. As your organization grows, so does the complexity in your sales process. At such a juncture, any small error in a process could have a domino effect on your organization, and no organization can really afford such a situation. To help overcome this hassle, Sandbox is offered by Zoho CRM. This is an environment to test your Zoho CRM settings before you can take it up to your production setup. This way you can feel much safer about the changes to your settings, as you can now test them, identify issues and fix them before you take them to your actual working setup. Let's look at this in terms of a scenario. We are a small-sized company in the manufacturing sector, but when it comes to business processes, we like to keep things a little tight and have everything accounted for. The number of machines, the sales orders that come through, workers shipped, we've got workflows and blueprints that tie the whole thing together. This forms a replica of our business process online, which enables the process in turn to run smoothly without any hiccups and automates most of the manual data entry and process calculation, assignments, scoring, and all the other smaller workings. Our company is still pretty small, but if there's more than one hand dabbling in the system, things could get out of hand without prior notification. And even if I am the only CRM admin, I'll sometimes need to be pretty sure of workflow changes before offsetting a chain of changes. So I like to use Sandbox. Not only do I get a space to test and build configurations without it changing around my actual CRM, I also get to deploy bits of all my rough work that I want right from within Sandbox. Now, if you're already familiar with the working of Sandbox, I do apologize for the time we are going to take here. But if not, look closely and try to open your CRM account and deploy it with me. All set? So let's create a new Sandbox. That list view that you saw right there, that's kind of new, but we'll talk about that a little later. The name and description are pretty straightforward. Initially, we didn't have this type of configuration to be selected. That's quite new. So we'll go with the configuration option, which was prevalent in our old Sandbox. This adding user also is quite new. I'm just going to select a few users here and create my sandbox. And we'll wait for our sandbox to be created. So I'm just going to use a pre-existing sandbox to show how it works inside. Really quick. You know you're in your sandbox when you see this orange ribbon over here indicating it is your test account. I go to my workflows. So over the past 6 months, I feel like our company has grown a little. So we'd like to increase the deal size for our big deal condition. So we are editing our big deal rule. Editing a few conditions. So that's pretty much the change we wanted to make with respect to our workflow rule. And it's done. We can look at deploying our changes, but since there have been quite a new enhancements, we'll look at deploying this change a little later while we discuss multiple sandbox. For now, let's look at what multiple sandbox really is. Multiple sandbox. This allows different teams to create differently functional sandboxes within Zoho CRM and simultaneously run them. Let's move back to our example of a manufacturing sector. Well, that was our business about a year ago. We've managed in the meantime to scale up, increase production and sales. We have had an increase in demand, and in turn, we have needed to alter some of our sales processes. Actually, quite a lot of our processes. Now that we have had to take 10 new employees, a mix of sales, marketing, and other roles, we've expanded. So our CRM admin is now tasked with making role changes. Our marketing team needs to take care of a larger base of customers with regular campaigns and with trying to understand evolving needs of customers and gauging what they're looking for next. Not to mention our sales team that has to keep changing up their strategy and sales process for the variety of deals that come through. Multiple sandboxes address three deficiencies. These new sandbox types make sure that firstly, the existing single sandbox type, while dynamic, didn't really provide separate testing environments for different users. It did allow external developers to be added apart from that one environment that all users could access, but beyond that, all our users needed to share that one environment. Now, users can independently test Sandbox without the changes affecting each other's test environments. Second, Now, we've always said that Sandbox is a replica of your CRM account where you can test just about anything. And that's all well and good. But when you do have users of different roles and profiles accessing it, with the new multiple sandbox type, we could go one step further to reduce conflict by choosing which sandbox configurations you can have. This means that you can choose which aspects of your setup page are accessible within each sandbox. We'll see this later. Till date, Sandbox has had only one type, those that are created with configuration. To run any data in your configurations in Sandbox, you would have to create your own records or import a file. The new enhancement, however, allows you to use sample data or your actual CRM data to test your configurations in Sandbox. Sample data comes in handy, especially when you have added an external developer and don't want customer data viewable to external users. Whereas for your internal users, you can choose for them to access CRM data and live test it. Of course, none of this affects your real live CRM data. But more on that later. A new list view of Sandbox accounts. Let's look at that first. We go to our Sandbox account, which of course is available under data administration. This is the new list view. This list view page is applicable since we now have multiple sandboxes. This space allows us to choose which ones we can have active and which ones we do not need running right now. But we will take a closer look at all these factors of the list view a little later on. Let's focus on creating a new sandbox, shall we? Alright. Like I said, for our use case, we have got several new teams on board that might help manage our business. So let's create new sandboxes accordingly. My new sandbox is going to be for our marketing team that has expanded, and with that, they've had to segment our customers differently. We also have a workflow related sandbox for our sales team that we'll alter a little later on. But for now, let's create this one for our marketing team. Analysis Sandbox is going to be our name. Let's skip the description and on to configuration type. Simply put, configuration type of sandbox allows you to simply create a sandbox just to test out your configuration, which means you just test out what you have created within your sandbox. You create a workflow, you simply test out the flow of your workflow without really seeing the data within it or running any data through it. If you choose configuration and data, you get to choose either sample data or partial production data. Sample data. But before we get into sample and partial production data, FYI, either of these options doesn't really, when you choose partial production data, it ensures that none of this really affects your data in your CRM account. Only the configurations will be pushed when you do push your changes to your CRM account. None of the tests done using your data will alter your data in your CRM account. Now, sample data provides 10 sample records which will be populated for these modules. And for partial data population, you can choose up to 10,000 records. All right. The sample data population, I think, is pretty interesting because the 10 records for each module seems decent, and it provides a pretty diverse sample set. But I think this will be better suited for when developers run it, when we have added an external developer and they want to run their CRM configurations without actually accessing CRM data. So let's go with partial production data. Like I said earlier, partial production data allows you to access up to 10,000 records per module. But you can also stick with 100. On to your modules list. I'll select leads and deals. You'll also see other options here where the modules list also gets updated, where each module displays whether it holds a parent lookup. So you can add these modules here as well so that any module level dependencies are taken care of. If you have a list of products and you want, for example, if you have a list of products and you want your user to access the quotes module, here you'll need to give access to both the products and accounts module which are its parents modules. Now this is purely from a data population angle, as you wouldn't be able to access or edit quotes module records otherwise. But this is no issue because when you select the child module here, the parent modules get auto-selected. With respect to this 100 records per module, in partial record population, you'll be able to access the 100 most recent records in every module. So for parent and child modules as well, you will only have 100 recent records. So those 100 records in the child module might not always be mapped to the 100 parent records. Only those records that are mapped will be accessible within the child's module. Done. Now on to users. You can select all the users that you want to access this. I'm going to add all my users who are in marketing. Additionally, you can add your developer here as well. If you already have added a developer to your account, you can just associate them with the sandbox. But I'm going to go with just those users for now. Now we're back to our list view page. Okay, here you can see all the sandbox that have been created. We also have the number of changes. We can see the number of users who can access each sandbox, and the created time and your status. The status part is pretty interesting. As you can see, the sandbox that we have just created is under the status of on creation right now, whereas 3 other sandboxes here are created. Here it says for our engine maintenance workflow sandbox that the next rebuild is in 3 days and the next rebuild in 1 day for 2 other sandboxes. As it is whenever we create a sandbox, it copies our production account, a replica of all the configurations we choose as it is in the production account. But since we don't allow the sandbox to make any changes to the live CRM account, they are considered 2 separate orgs. Sandbox here runs independently, making its own changes, and over there in our live account, processes are running smoothly as well. If you feel like you need a fresh replica of your CRM account in Sandbox, complete with all the changes that happened between your last Sandbox creation and your current CRM account, you can choose to rebuild the Sandbox. This, of course, wipes all the changes you have made in your current Sandbox account and you'll have to start afresh. If you do so, in best practice, it is advisable to deploy the changes you want or are sure of to your live account before you start rebuilding your Sandbox. The interval listed here, the 3 days rebuild and 1 day rebuild, it shows how long it is until you can next rebuild your Sandbox. Alright, so configuration and data sandboxes require 3 days and just configuration sandbox requires a single day. Our new sandbox is activated. Let's look at accessing it. Alright, so now let's take a look at running our new sandbox. We go back to our sandbox builder page and access our analysis sandbox. Again, we can be quite sure that we are in our sandbox page, in fact, by this orange ribbon on top. Now, before we get into working our sandbox, there's this really cool feature over here where under your account, you can choose your sandbox. Here, you can toggle between different sandbox accounts and work on multiple things simultaneously if needed. You can also set a default sandbox by going to your manage option over here. You can choose to set a sandbox as default based on the one that you work on the most. I'm quite happy with my current default sandbox, so I'm going to let it be. As you can see, our data is all populated and we can move on to building configurations within the sandbox. So I'm going to go to my setup page and we'll go to segmentation. As a marketing analyst, I like to keep my customer segmentation updated. So I'm deactivating this segmentation and editing this one. So I'm going to choose my closing date is after 2021. As 3 and make this one change. I'll retain the frequency fields, and for my monetary I'm going to extend my lower limit a little further and change the higher limit quite a bit. So now I have altered my RFM fields and I think I'll change one of my segment labels over here. Let's create a new label for do not purchase, because I don't want my sales reps going after records that seem like a waste of time. I think I won't be able to publish this since I can only publish a single segmentation model in a day, and I've exceeded the limit, so let's just use this for our editing purposes. Additionally, I want to make a few changes to another sandbox that I have created. Go to the maintenance sandbox. Right. Over here, I want to make a few edits to my workflows. Lead conversion automation. So let's edit this one a bit. Change our trigger when our lead is created and when the lead status is contacted, we convert the lead. So there we go. Now let's move on to deployment. We have two types of deployment. Complete deployment and partial deployment. All the components or items listed in the change set will be deployed in terms of complete deployment. And when it comes to partial deployment, only specific components or items that you select in the change set will be deployed. Speaking of which, what's a change set? Let's go to our sandboxes. Oops. Right. This is our list view page of all our sandboxes, as we talked about earlier. So here you can see a number of changes option that gives you a count of the number of changes made in each sandbox recently. Once you go into a sandbox, you'll be able to view the change set. This change set list over here. These change sets are spaces within your sandbox where you can view all the changes made and where we can choose which ones we want to deploy. We'll also find over here that we can find the changes that are categorized based on certain parameters. We have a components and items section over here. This shows all the changes which are made for each feature, and for example, if a group is created in the sandbox, then group will be the component. and the name you entered for the group in the sandbox will be the item. So there you have it. A record type that shows which module the changes are made in. So both of these are made for the contacts module. You can see that here. The action that shows whether a certain change was either whether it was updated or added or deleted, the users that initiated the change, and the timeline. The linked option shows other items associated with the selected item, and you can see the difference here. You can see it highlighted. Alright, so now on to deploying these changes. Complete and partial deployment. So you can choose whether you want to deploy all of them to production or not. A pop-up message will show which or if all of your messages are qualified when you choose what to deploy. For example, I am going to choose just a single segmentation to deploy because I would prefer to select just this, and perhaps I'm not sure about the first set of changes. So here we have our pop-up. The start deployment page that shows us the changes that are qualified or any that are conflicted. In my case, I have my change is qualified, but sometimes you'll find a conflicted change as well, in which case you cannot proceed with the deployment because these changes might cause issues like overriding names, exceeding feature limit, or missing parent items. Since that isn't a problem here, let's proceed. Now that our deployment is completed, we can see that the number of changes in our analysis sandbox has come down from 2 to 1. This option over here called deployment logs is another useful tip that has come up. So until now, deployment logs for each of the sandbox were located within the respective environment. So you would have to go within each sandbox and view the deployment logs. But now, since we do have multiple sandbox environments, it makes sense to have a common space for all deployment logs. This display shows it all under a single tab, and the common space is available within the sandbox list view page. So you can choose to filter this as well, view it for a particular sandbox over here. Additionally, you can choose to filter the deployment logs in case you have a lot and want to view it for a particular time period, or you want to view it by a particular component or item or field or module, or for particular users. That's up to you. So here a CRM admin who wants to view all the deployment logs can view them for all sandboxes under this list. And it's not just for admins. Any user with managed sandbox permission can view the deployment logs of all sandbox environments. Users who have permission to access a particular sandbox environment will be able to view logs for only that sandbox. This gives users the autonomy to view their own sandbox history and also the CRM manager to keep track of all changes happening across all sandboxes. So one last thing, let's look at how to add a developer within a sandbox. When it comes to adding a developer, a lot of testing within CRM is usually done, and it can be a little tricky. And I think we all can appreciate that. For example, imagine testing out workflows with custom functions in CRM regularly, even for CRM activities, and using Sandbox itself to test all the features before they go out. It might require an extra hand. Several businesses outsource certain configurational activities to external developers. So instead of having them log in as a CRM user, we can give them just Sandbox access. They can also make sure all the processes are error-free before getting deployed into the production account. To add a developer in our Sandbox page, we have the option here. So we input our developer's name. And we choose a role for our developer. And now we can choose what sandboxes to assign to our developer. I'm comfortable with my developer accessing all the sandboxes, so I'm going to. But you can choose to give access to only certain sandboxes. When you hit save, an invitation email will be sent to the developer with access to only that sandbox or those sandboxes that you have given them, that you have added them to. You can add up to 5 developers here, and there's no need to worry. This doesn't require us to purchase any additional user licenses. Additionally, when you create a new sandbox and you select a user, you can also add one of a developer if you already have them added to your account. Alright, now on to edition limits. For Enterprise Edition, we have 3 configuration and 2 configuration and data sandboxes. For Ultimate, it is 7 configuration sandboxes and 3 configuration and data sandboxes. So I've exhausted my 2 configuration and data sandboxes, and I would have 2 configuration sandboxes left here. Additionally, a few other things to keep in mind with respect to sandbox. Updating a field in a sandbox and deploying the changes to production will override existing field properties. For example, if the email field is marked as mandatory in sandbox and as a unique field in production, then after deployment, the field property will be overwritten to mandatory. To know whether you are working on a sandbox environment or production, like we mentioned earlier, look for the orange ribbon over here. Sandbox is used to test and validate configurations before they are moved onto the production account. Therefore, records populated, imported, or manually added to the sandbox account cannot be deployed to production, which is what we talked about earlier with respect to data in your sandbox and data in CRM. Thank you.